If you grew up in the United States or Canada during the 1980s, your Saturday mornings may have followed a familiar routine. You woke up before your parents, grabbed a bowl of cereal that had a name like chocolate frosted sugar bombs, which had the probable nutritional equivalent of cardboard, and then parked yourself in front of the television. For the next several hours, you watched a parade of muscle-bound heroes, evil villains, explosions, laser battles, all of which were meant to sell the toys that were advertised in between episodes. At the time, it felt like harmless entertainment. Nobody actively looked at He-Man riding Battle Cat or Duke leading the G.I. Joe team and thought, this is carefully packaged lesson about Cold War masculinity. But in hindsight, that's exactly what it was. I'm your host David, and today we are heading back to my childhood and looking at Saturday morning cartoons. This is the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't simply a geopolitical conflict fought through proxy wars, nuclear deterrence, and espionage. It was a cultural struggle. Americans spent decades debating what kind of country they were, what values they represented, and what sort of citizens they hoped to produce. Those conversations appeared in political speeches and newspaper editorials, but they also appeared in movies, television shows, advertisements, and even the toy aisle at the local department store. By the 1980s, children's entertainment had become one of the most effective vehicles for selling ideas about power, heroism, citizenship, and gender. Millions of American boys spent their weekends watching stories that taught them what a hero looked like, how a hero behaved, and perhaps most importantly, what a man was supposed to be. And the answers to any questions asked were rarely subtle. To understand why, we need to start with the political and cultural environment that produced these cartoons. The 1970s had been a difficult decade for the United States. The Vietnam War ended not with victory, but with helicopters evacuating personnel from Saigon. Watergate shattered public trust in government, and the subsequent congressional investigations like the Church Committee eroded the very foundation that trust had been built on. Economic crisis and inflation created widespread anxiety. Internationally, as détente ended and a new arms race loomed, Americans worried about Soviet expansion and questioned whether their country remained the dominant global power that it had appeared to be after the Second World War. But by the time Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, a new language of strength and confidence was taking hold. Americans were encouraged to believe once again in military power, national greatness, and technological superiority. The nation was not declining, Reagan argued, it simply needed to rediscover its confidence. And those ideas didn't stay confined to politics. They flowed through popular culture, like electricity through a circuit board. Action films became bigger, heroes became more muscular, military imagery became more glamorous. The nation that had spent much of the 1970s wrestling with uncertainty suddenly found itself celebrating confidence, strength, and power. Think of the transformation in tone and message from Rambo First Blood in 1982 to Rambo First Blood Part 2 in 1985, for example. Now, at exactly the same moment, something else was happening that would transform children's television forever. Toy companies realized they could stop treating cartoons as entertainment and start treating them as marketing. Changes in advertising regulations during the Reagan era allowed toy manufacturers unprecedented opportunities to create programming tied directly to products. The result was a business model so successful that it effectively reshaped an entire generation's childhood. Shows like G.I. Joe, Transformers, He-Man, and M.A.S.K weren't merely cartoons. They were parts of integrated marketing systems. The television show sold the toys. The toys reinforced the television show. Together, they created immersive worlds that children could bring home from the store. Yet, while these franchises were designed to sell action figures, they also sold something less obvious. They sold identities. Let's consider G.I. Joe. The franchise arrived at a fascinating moment in American history. Although Joe first found success in 1964, the brand was reintroduced in 1982, tied to a full line of toys. Less than a decade after Vietnam, here was a cartoon that transformed military service into an exciting adventure. The G.I. Joe team, who weren't superheroes, let's remember, represented courage, competence, discipline, and patriotism. Their enemy, Cobra, represented evil in its purest and most uncomplicated form. Cobra's plans were absurd. Cobra's leaders were ridiculous. Cobra existed largely so that American heroes could defeat them. Sorry, Cobra Commander. But notice what was missing. There were no debates about foreign policy, no moral ambiguity, no questions about interventionism, no discussions of civilian casualties, no traumatized veterans struggling with PTSD to reintegrate into society. That's post-Cobra stress disorder. The complicated realities of warfare vanished entirely. Instead, children received a version of military heroism stripped of consequences and uncertainty. The military wasn't frightening, it wasn't controversial, it wasn't political, it was cool. And this mattered because G.I. Joe helped to effectively rehabilitate military imagery for a generation too young to remember Vietnam. The franchise presented soldiers not as complicated human beings navigating difficult circumstances, but as idealized heroes whose moral correctness was never in doubt. The message was clear. Good men were brave, disciplined, physically capable, and always ready to defend freedom against evil. In many ways, G.I. Joe represented a broader cultural effort to restore confidence in American power during what became the final decade of the Cold War. Now, if G.I. Joe taught boys how to be soldiers, then He-Man taught them how to be men. On the surface, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe seemed completely disconnected from Cold War politics. The setting is a fantasy kingdom populated by sorcerers, monsters, and villains whose fashion choices suggest they lost a fight with a heavy metal album cover, probably Gwar. Yet beneath the fantasy setting lies a remarkably familiar vision of masculinity. Everything about He-Man communicates power. He's physically enormous. He's fearless. He is decisive. His authority is unquestioned. Even the transformation sequence from Prince Adam to He-Man carries a surprisingly clear message about gender and identity. Prince Adam begins as an ordinary-looking young man, but when he raises the Sword of Power and declares, "By the power of Grayskull!" he transforms into an idealized version of masculinity. His muscles expand, his voice deepens, his confidence increases. He's dressed like a leather daddy with fur-lined underwear. Importantly though, the transformation does not make him more compassionate, more thoughtful, or more emotionally intelligent. It just makes him stronger. That distinction is important because it reflects a broader cultural trend emerging during the 1980s. This was the decade of bodybuilding culture, action movies, and heroes whose biceps appeared to have their own gravitational fields. Arnold Schwarzenegger became an international superstar. Sylvester Stallone transformed Rambo, a broken Vietnam vet, into a one-man army. Across popular culture, physical strength increasingly became a visual shorthand for virtue, competence, and leadership. He-Man simply translated that ideal into a format children could understand. The hero was not merely good. The hero looked powerful. Physical dominance became a symbol of moral superiority. At the same time, other franchises introduced a different but equally important aspect of Cold War masculinity, technological mastery. Shows like M.A.S.K. and Transformers emerged from a society obsessed with innovation. The Cold War had produced the space race, advanced military technology, early computer revolutions, and a widespread belief that technological superiority would determine the future. Americans were constantly told that innovation was the key to victory, and not surprisingly, children's entertainment absorbed these assumptions. The heroes of M.A.S.K. controlled incredible vehicles packed with futuristic gadgets. The Transformers represented the ultimate fusion of machine and warrior. Competence increasingly meant understanding technology. In these franchises, strength was no longer enough. The ideal hero also needed technical expertise and mastery over complex systems if they intended to roll out. Looking back, these shows functioned almost like miniature lessons in Cold War ideology. They celebrated technological advancement, rewarded competence, and suggested that power belonged to those capable of controlling sophisticated tools. The future belonged to the strong, but it also belonged to the technologically skilled. Of course, there is another question worth asking. Where were the girls? And that answer is complicated. Many of these franchises included female characters who were surprisingly capable for their era. Scarlet in G.I. Joe was a skilled fighter and strategist. Teela in He-Man frequently demonstrated greater confidence than some of the male characters around her. Even villains, like Cobra's the Baroness, often appeared more effective than their male counterparts. Yet these characters existed within worlds fundamentally organized around male power. The central heroes were men, the chosen ones were men, the characters who dominated toy shelves were men. The stories revolved around male leadership, male conflict, and male definitions of strength. What children learned wasn't necessarily that girls couldn't be strong, rather they learned that strength itself was coded masculine. The heroes who shaped these worlds were expected to be physically dominant, emotionally controlled, technologically competent, and ready for conflict. Those traits became associated with masculinity in ways that often excluded alternative visions of what manhood might look like. We also need to acknowledge that there were a number of cartoons in the 80s that were pink-coded, aimed at girls. Recall shows like Gem, My Little Pony, and Rainbow Bright, among others. These shows featured women and girls as protagonists, but they themselves reinforced notions of caring, cooperation, and nurturing as the best ways to overcome challenges. She-Ra, Pink He-Man, is the obvious example that bucks this trend, but it was very much an outlier on Saturday morning TV. Now, before anyone starts drafting an angry letter accusing me of blaming Skeletor, for every modern societal problem, it's important to be precise. These cartoons did not invent toxic masculinity. They didn't create sexism, and they didn't single-handedly shape an entire generation's worldview. Because, come on, culture is rarely that simple. What these shows did, even if unintentionally, was reinforce existing social values and package them in an extraordinarily effective format. They reflected ideas already circulating throughout American society while helping normalize them for young audiences. And it's worth acknowledging that many of the values they promoted were genuinely admirable. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice, perseverance, teamwork, and protecting others are not bad lessons for children. In fact, they're pretty good ones. The problem wasn't the virtues themselves. The problem was the narrow definition of how those virtues could be expressed. Strength usually meant physical strength. Leadership often meant command. Emotional vulnerability was largely absent, and problems were solved through confrontation rather than communication. Heroes rarely expressed uncertainty, fear, or dependence on others. The result was a version of masculinity that could be noble and inspiring while simultaneously being restrictive. Children learned that heroes were brave. They also learned that heroes rarely cried. Children learned that heroes protected people, but they also learned that heroes solved most problems through force. Children learned that heroes were confident, but they rarely learned that heroes could be vulnerable. Those lessons mattered because they arrived at an age when children were still figuring out who they wanted to become. Today, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union exists primarily in history books, documentaries, Vladimir Putin's wet dreams, and perpetual arguments on the internet. Saturday morning cartoon blocks have largely disappeared, replaced by streaming services and YouTube algorithms. Yet, the children raised on G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, and M.A.S.K are now adults in leadership positions. The action figures may be packed away in attics and storage boxes, but the cultural messages remain surprisingly recognizable. Contemporary debates around masculinity still revolve around many of the same questions these cartoons helped popularize. What makes a good man? What does strength actually mean? Is power measured through dominance, protection, competence, emotional resilience, or something else entirely? The answers to these questions continue to evolve. No doubt the debates continue as well because the Cold War was about stories as much as it was about missiles and diplomacy. Stories about freedom and power, stories about heroism, and about who Americans believed themselves to be. Some of those stories were delivered through presidential speeches. Others were delivered through action figures, toy commercials, and cartoon theme songs. And every Saturday morning, millions of children sat in front of their televisions absorbing these lessons without realizing they were lessons at all. Some of the Cold War's most enduring ideas survived the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of Saturday morning cartoons. They survived because they had already found a permanent home in American popular culture. Sometimes history is transmitted through treaties and political institutions, and sometimes It's transmitted through a man riding a giant green tiger while wielding a sword the size of a canoe. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which just wants to watch cartoons until 11 a.m. when Saved by the Bell comes on. Zach Morris was kind of an asshole. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.